Digo, mijo, qué guapo.
Gracias, mami.
I invited a guest tonight. Can you get the apartment ready? Oh, maybe put on some music to set the mood?
I used to really detest Miles Morales. It wasn't because of anything that I disliked about his character. I was just bitter that writer Brian Michael Bendis chose to end my favorite comic book run of all time, Ultimate Spider-Man, before I felt like it needed to wrap up, only then to reboot it with Miles at the helm. I didn't understand why Peter Parker needed to be killed off in the series in order to usher in a new version of Spider-Man. Eventually, I overcame my irrational annoyance with Miles and chose to read those comics that I swore off for so long, only to find out that he was incredibly charming, compelling, and a wall crawler in his own right. With Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, those personal, I bet stupid walls that I built up over the years have continued to tumble down even more. Miles Morales doesn't just continue to be another great outing for Insomniac Games in its take on the Spider-Verse, but it shows that Miles himself is deserving of being thrust into the spotlight more often. Not to mention, it also proves to be a great reason to have already made the jump to next gen with PS5. Miles Morales picks up 1 year after the events of Marvel's Spider-Man, with the titular character now trying to come into his own as a web slinger. After a wild opening sequence, Peter informs Miles that he'll be leaving New York City for a few weeks to go on an overseas trip with Mary Jane. As the sole Spider-Man left in New York, Miles must quickly find a way to come into his own and defend his newfound home of Harlem from an ongoing war between the corporation Roxxon and a new group known as the Underground. For the most part, the story of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales continues to be just as effective as Insomniac's previous outing. The characterization of not only Miles, but those around him like Finn, Genki, and Aaron Davis is a standout in this title's 8 to 12 hour runtime. The game's protagonist, the Tinkerer, also provides to be quite intriguing as it is a great first baddie for Miles to take on his lonesome. That being said, the shorter length of Miles Morales doesn't always do the narrative any favors. Oftentimes the game feels like it's trying to compress too much character work and storytelling into a more concise period of time, making some ensuing decisions and actions from the characters feel a bit confusing. This shortened runtime also makes for a lesser number of scenes that aren't specifically focused on pushing the narrative forward. Those small character-driven scenes that were scattered throughout Marvel's Spider-Man, I specifically love the texting sequence between Peter and Mary Jane, were fewer and farther between this time around. By the end of Miles Morales, I was definitely still caught up in the story that I was being told, but it never reached the same heights as I saw in the previous game. Luckily, on the gameplay front, Miles Morales does find a way to improve on what was already found in Marvel's Spider-Man. For the most part, all the game's mechanics are identical to what has been seen before. Swinging around town, hand-to-hand combat, and stealth are all roughly the same here in Miles Morales. But thanks to Miles himself having some different superpowers compared to Peter, each element is spiced up a bit. The most notable difference here is likely come in the way that Miles can utilize Venom, which is essentially an electric-style charge that he can emit from his body. Miles has a number of these Venom powers at his disposal, which each are a ton of fun to utilize. In tandem, and with some other new gadgets and the ability to go completely invisible, Miles Morales gives you far more freedom when it comes to combat, which is a welcoming step. I'm not sure how Insomniac will look to improve on combat specifically once the focus is back on Peter as an inevitable sequel, but they have their work cut out for them. If there's one area of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales that I'm a bit let down with, it comes to the game's open world structure. Much like before, the side tasks that are thrown at you in the game aren't very compelling, and instead, they're what I would describe as checklist oriented. Many of the other aspects of the game are just requests for you to find various collectibles, shut down enemy strongholds, or complete odd jobs around the city. In a time where open world games of this style just aren't as common as they once were, the structure of both Marvel Spider-Man games continue to feel dated, even if it's always fun swinging through the city between each task. Despite this, I do have to say that all the actual side missions and other assorted objectives in Miles Morales find a way to be meaningful, deepening the characters and fleshing out the world. The vast majority of the side missions in the game take place in Harlem, leading to Miles actually feeling like a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man in practice. Even some of the other collectible assignments end up deepening Miles' relationship to characters in ways that I wouldn't expect, while also providing the player with more insight into understanding their backstory. Most of the RPG elements from Marvel's Spider-Man are also back this time around in Miles Morales, so you should know what to expect on that front. I have to say that I found a lot of the extra suits in Miles to be pretty lacking. This isn't shocking considering Miles has less of a history to pull from compared to Peter, but even with that said, the Into the Spider-Verse and the Bodega catsuit are big standouts. It might be the best two overall costumes seen in either Spider-Man games. One other weird mentionable is that I found it downright strange how Insomniac locks certain aspects of Miles Morales behind the game's New Game Plus mode. Unless you beat the game and start the New Game Plus mode, you can unlock all the suits, max out your gadget upgrades, or even purchase all of your skills until heading into New Game Plus. I'm sure Insomniac wanted to incentivize players to revisit the experience before beating it once and then putting it down forever. It's really unsatisfying when you've seen a game to completion and noticeably still have certain elements that you outright can unlock without needing to start all over. The biggest elephant in this room with the review is that I haven't even touched on how Marvel's Spider-Man Morales performs on PS5. As what is arguably the console's biggest launch title, Miles Morales does an excellent job of making you feel like you're getting your money's worth as a day one investor on the PS5. While the title is also available on the PS4, the lighting, character models, and sheer scope of NYC in the PS5 iteration are on another level. Combined with this and the fact that there are virtually no load times to be found, and the DualSense controller makes you feel like you're much closer to the real-life web singing. It's easy for me to say that this feels like the first true next-gen game that I feel like I have played. Even without taking into account the game's appearance on next-gen hardware, what Insomniac has done with the scope of its set pieces in Miles Morales compared to the previous entry is astounding. I mentioned it previously, but the opening moments of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales makes one of the most breathtaking sequences found in either game. Even in the rest of the experience doesn't live up to the gravitas of this opening mission, those that you come across later are just as compelling in more ways than one. Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales is a worthy follow-up to the previous installment, even if a lot of the core DNA has remained the same. Despite some rough edges, the experience as a whole is one that's hard to put down once you get entrenched. This proved to be doubly true if you're playing on the PS5 and are really looking for games that are going to show you what Next Gen's leap is all about. Even though the first game in this new franchise from Insomniac might still be the one I prefer overall, Miles Morales gives us more than an apt taste of where we can see this series going on into the future, which makes me quite excited, to say the least. For more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button at youtube.com/DualShockers. Leave a like if you liked the video. If you want to read the article, please, it's at DualShockers.com. And for more stuff, definitely check it here. Thank you.